It is used in Greco-Roman literature to refer to the Roman Senate and in different places like that. So it's just a reference to people. And I think that the reason why these first believers in Yeshua were called that is because they met in a specific place in the temple. And they were called the Kahila, the assembling, the gathering. That's where they gather. And this term stuck to this group of people. Now later in the 2nd century, as we see more and more Gentiles come into the faith, and Judaism starts to reject belief in Yeshua, we start to see this big split in the 2nd century. And so many of these Gentile church leaders said, well, how are we going to make this distinction between us and the non-believing Jewish community? And so they adopted this term, Kyrie Oikos, or house of the Lord, because keep in mind, where did they meet oftentimes in those settings? They met in houses, is what ended up happening by the time of the 2nd century. So this term church came about because of that. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that this term that we see as translated church here in the book of Acts in English, it just goes back to this term ecclesia that is used in the Septuagint, the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. And so it's used throughout Scripture. And what happens is that we oftentimes see this cut point distinction between the synagogue and the church. And if we just simply translate it, and in fact, I think the Tree of Life version chooses to translate it as assembly. And I like that because, not that I'm against the term church, but it shows this cohesion and connection to the nation of Israel that the early community of faith had. And that's important. But Paul was persecuting people. Therefore, in verse 4, those who had been scattered about were preaching the word. They were preaching the word, and Philip went down to the city of Samaria, and he began. And this is not Philip. This is not Philip the apostle. This is probably the Ethiopian. I think it states that that is an evangelist. He began proclaiming Mashiach. And Philip had this amazing ability. God had gifted him. Keep in mind, not everybody in the 1st century had the gift of miraculous sign gifts. And now I don't believe that there's any sign gift or any miraculous gift that God has given, or any of the gifts that are mentioned in the apostolic writings that are done away with today. I'm not a dispensationalist. I believe that any gift that God gave then, He gave now because He gave it for the benefit of the Kahila. But we do know that the apostles had an extra measure of the Spirit upon them. They had an ability, and they had these sign gifts, power upon them. They had spent time with Yeshua, and it just makes sense that they would be able to do some of these things. Philip had this apostolic connection of being able to perform miracles and do a lot of great things. And it says that many of them were being healed, paralyzed, and lame were healed. And there was much rejoicing in the city. And then in verse 9, we switch to see that there's a man named Simon who was formerly a practicing magic in the city, and he was astounding the people of Samaria, claiming to be someone great. And I'm not going to read all of that, but the text tells us that he sees what Philip is doing. And you can imagine as a magician, am I saying that right? As a magician, you can imagine that he's like, well, wait a minute, that's my job. And here's Philip doing these great things in the name of this Yeshua guy. And naturally that appeals to him. And the text tells us that he even himself became to be a believer, and he was immersed, and he comes to faith in Yeshua. Now, is it a genuine or not? We don't know. How genuine is it? That's true for a lot of people that come to faith. That may take on a profession of faith, that may go through a baptism, may go through immersion. Is it genuine or not? We don't know. I mean, all we can do is take them at their word, and that's all the apostles could do, was take him at his word. But we start to see some question here. And what were his true motives?